Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Water Commission on May 20th, 2021. If we could have the roll call, please. We'll call to order and have the roll call, please.
Yes, Commissioner Cooney,
Present.
Commissioner Young,
Here.
Vice Chair Davis.
Here.
And Chair Keller.
Here.
And Councilmember Liaison Sneddon.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any changes to the agenda?
Chair Keller, no changes to the agenda.
Thank you very much. Do we have any public comment at this moment?
Seeing no raised hands for public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 consent items, the meeting minutes, the authorization to execute a $1.5 million grant funding agreement for the desalination product water pump station upgrades project. That's a mouthful. And then another one, the contract for professional services for soil remediation consulting services for the fiscal year 21A water main replacement report. Do we have any comments, or do we wish to go directly to a vote?
I do have a question, if I could, on item B, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Just for staff, it's really quick. I understand this to be the funding for the pump station upgrade, which would be part of the conveyance project. This is 1.5. Can you remind me again what the total cost of the conveyance project might be?
Commissioner Davis, the total cost, that project is currently out to bid, and we're expecting the cost for that project to be somewhere around $14 million at this time. But as you know, we're in a really unique environment with regards to prices on construction. So we're going to be monitoring that closely, and we hope to have feedback on that or a bid come in the next couple of weeks.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
Okay, can we please have the roll call for the vote?
Yes, Commissioner Cooney,
Yes.
Commissioner Young,
Yes.
Vice Chair Davis,
Yes.
and Chair Keller.
Yes. Okay, thank you, everybody. So next we'll move on to our administrative items. The first one will be a water supply update. So please go ahead and give us the presentation.
Excuse me, I'd like to introduce Ms. Corey, who is our water supply analyst, and she'll be presenting on this topic.
Thank you. Good morning, commissioners and council liaison Sneddon. My name is Dakota Corey, and I'm the water supply analyst. And today I'm going to provide a water supply update. Typically, we provide these updates twice a year and then as needed in between. The first time that we usually provide the update is at the beginning of the water year, which is in October, and then at the end of the rainy season, which typically is in May. And so here we are at the end of the rainy season, and it's been a pretty interesting year in terms of the rainy season. So I'm going to provide an update today on where our various water supplies stand. Next slide, please. Quick outline of my presentation. We'll look at the drought status, both statewide and locally. We'll also look at current demand here in the city. And then we'll look at each of our individual water supplies and where they stand. And finally, we'll put that all together into a water supply strategy that compares supply and demand to see where we stand. I will give a little spoiler alert here. It's good news. We are in a good place with our water supplies currently. Next slide, please. So first, let's look at drought across the state. And this graph here is one that I've shared with the Water Commission in the past. It comes from the county, and it's normal compared to average water year rainfall. And so you can see the hashed red line about 1/3 of the way up the graph. That represents average or normal rainfall in any given year over the historical record. You can see in this graph specifically, the data goes back to 1980. And anything in the bar graph that is green represents a wet year or more than 120% of normal. Blue lines represent normal water years, and then the brown lines represent dry years, and dry years are defined as 80% or less than normal. And so you can see in the far right-hand corner in the yellow bar, that's the current water year 2021, and we are definitely in a dry year. So we've come out of the end of the rainy season. The typical rainy season in Santa Barbara is like from January to March, April. We're now in May, and we've received quite less than normal. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the percent of normal at various locations that are important to the city. So up at Gibraltar Reservoir, we've seen 41% of normal, at Lake Cachuma, 53% of normal, and Santa Barbara, 40% of normal. We can move on to the next slide. This is a graphic provided by the federal government, the U.S. Drought Monitor, looking specifically at the state of California. And you can see that the Drought Monitor classifies the entire state as in a drought. If we focus on Santa Barbara County, you can see that we're classified in a severe drought, which is not as bad as other parts of the state, which are facing extreme drought and exceptional drought. Looking ahead into the summer, the NOAA is predicting above average temperatures. So this drought monitor is calculated based on several things like soil moisture, snowpack, precipitation, and statewide, we are seeing drought conditions. And you've probably heard discussion about drought in California in the news. The governor has declared a drought emergency in certain counties, and various parts of the state are looking pretty dire at this point because we had such a dry winter. Next slide, please. So let's look at demand in the city. This is another graph that you've seen in the past, but just to kind of orient ourselves, we look at 2013 actual data. That's the gray dashed line. And you'll remember that we used 2013 as a benchmark that was defined by the state as pre-drought conditions. And then on this graph, the blue line represents our target water demand, and the red line represents actual water demands. And so in this graph, we were expecting to see 20% less than 2013 actual demands. And you can see the red line and the blue lines are really tracking quite closely. And so our community is on track with the demands that we've projected through the water year. Next slide, please. This is another graphic that we share fairly regularly. I think this one is really telling. We've talked a lot in Water Commission about the new normal. So the idea that we don't necessarily want to continue to use 2013 as our benchmark for what demands will look like going forward, because we know things are going to look different coming out of this last drought. And so in this graph, the solid black line represents total production, including both potable and recycled water. The black hashed line with X marks, that was our old demand projection from our 2011 long-term water supply plan. And you can see that we tracked that fairly closely until we hit the most recent drought in about 2014, where you can see demand falls off pretty steeply. And then the blue line in the right-hand side of the graph represents the demand projection we developed as part of our enhanced urban water management plan. And if you'll recall, the steepness of that blue line is because we're anticipating new demands associated with our water supply agreements, both with Montecito Water District and La Cumbre Mutual Water District. So if you compare the actual solid black line to that blue demand line, you'll see that we're tracking very much on target with our projections at this point. And staff is going to continue to monitor that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So now let's look at each of our individual water supplies. We'll start with Gibraltar Reservoir. This is a reservoir on the San Ynez River that's owned and operated by the city. And currently, Gibraltar is basically empty. It has 554 acre feet of water stored, or about 12% of its capacity. We really saw negligible inflows into Gibraltar this year because we had so little rainfall. But we were able to utilize the water that had been stored in Gibraltar from the last rainy season. It last spilled in March 2020. And so for water year 21, we've actually been able to divert over 1,200 acre feet for use at the city, and that's been an important supply source. And we'll see how that all comes together with our other supplies a little bit later in the presentation. But the short story is that using water in Gibraltar has allowed us to store more water in Lake Cachuma. Next slide, please. Cachuma Reservoir is another large supply source of surface water for the city. It's a shared resource, so the city is one of several agencies that keep water stored in Lake Cachuma. Current capacity of Cachuma is about 60%, or a little over 114,000 acre feet. Of that water stored in Lake Cachuma, the city's stored supply is just under 25,000 acre feet, and that represents about 2.5 years of total demand for the city stored in Lake Cachuma right now. And I do have a breakdown on the slide of how much of that is our current water year allocation on Lake Cachuma, and then over 16,000 acre feet is carried over from previous years. And this is where the management of our various water supplies gets really important. As we utilize other supplies that we have available to us, we build up this carryover water in Lake Cachuma. And then that can be a really important resource and buffer as we head into dry years like we are now. Just a side note here, the member units or the other water agencies that have water stored in Lake Cachuma will be requesting their water year 22 allocation for Lake Cachuma by July 1st. So we'll probably have an update on that in the next couple of months in terms of what allocation we receive. Next slide, please. Another source that the city has available to it is the State Water Project. And you have probably heard quite a bit about this source in the news. Across the state, water availability is really limited. And for this year, the allocation on the State Water Project is only 5%. That ties with 2014 for the lowest ever State Water Project allocation. What that means for the city is our Table A amount, or our potential to receive water from the State Water Project, is 3,300 acre feet of water. 5% of that is 165 acre feet. So we have very little water available to us from the State Water Project. A side note on that, we do have some State Water Project water from previous years that we've carried over and stored in San Luis Reservoir. So actually the city has about 900 acre feet of State Water Project water currently available to us. We don't plan on using any of that water currently, even with dry conditions coming. If the dry conditions were to continue for a couple of years, it would probably make sense in water year 2023 to start bringing some of that water down from San Luis Reservoir to Lake Cachuma to prepare for continued dry conditions. Another note on the State Water Project is we do have some water debt associated with previous purchases of supplemental water during the last drought. That's currently 2,000 acre feet of water. The plan is to repay that water debt when we have a higher allocation on the State Water Project. We have several years to pay it back. If that isn't looking feasible, we also could purchase water and pay it back that way. Next slide, please. Groundwater is continuing to slowly recover. Question, Commissioner Davis?
Yes, just quickly. You said bringing water from San Luis down to Cachuma. What's the arrangement for storing state water in Cachuma?
So our water supply contract doesn't allow us to store state water in Cachuma, although in the last drought an exception was made. And so if we were heading into drought conditions again, I think we'd be looking for that option. And then that allows us to have easier access to that water. But typically what we do right now is every month we put an order in with CCWA, and they require that, or they have that water come down to Cachuma, and we're supposed to use it within 30 days of its arrival.
Great, good, thank you very much.
Sure. Another question, Commissioner Young?
Yeah, thank you. So on the water debt, is that the cheapest way for us to pay back that debt, is when the SWP allocation is higher?
Yeah, because there wouldn't be additional purchase costs associated with that. If we were to look at purchasing water, we'd probably want to look in wetter years when water is less expensive. But fortunately, we have some time to make that decision.
What about giving up the 165 acre feet? for right now? I mean, is that an option?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We could definitely kind of whittle away at that debt, if you will. One thing that we do have in place is we have what we call an exchange agreement with ID1, which is another contractor that utilizes Lake Cachuma. And the way that works is we exchange our state water project water with them, and we receive storage in Cachuma in lieu of that. And it's an engineering exchange an agreement. So I don't totally understand, or I wouldn't feel comfortable explaining right now how that all works. But typically when we have a low allocation like this, we just reserve it for our obligations with that exchange agreement. Excuse me.
All right, sounds complicated.
It is.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can probably skip up to the groundwater slide. Thank you. So as you'll probably recall, excuse me, we utilized our groundwater resources quite a bit in the last drought. That's typically a drought supply for us. So we keep water in storage during wet years, and then we call on it during dry years when our surface water supplies are diminished. And so currently our groundwater basins look somewhat similar to what they did coming out of the last drought in the late 80s, early 90s. And since 2017, we have been resting our groundwater wells and our groundwater basins to allow them to naturally recharge. We expect full recovery of the basins to take 5 to 10 years. And I did look at the graphs recently to see where we're at. And in terms of storage in the Foothill Basin, we are seeing an upward trend of storage. And then in terms of seawater intrusion in storage unit 1, we're seeing a downward trend of chlorides in the water. So we are seeing the groundwater basins recover in a positive direction. It's just going to take several years to fully get there. And I will mention that in the monthly Water Resources Managers Report, which is part of the Water Commission packet, those groundwater basin charts are included this time around, so you can see those. In terms of groundwater, some exciting news is we've been working with the State Water Resources Control Board in order to initiate a pilot program for artificial recharge of treated surface water in our groundwater basins. And there were some regulatory hurdles that we needed to work through, and we've gotten there. And so we're looking at when we can potentially pilot that program. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share with you, if you've been with us for a while, you'll recall that we had a pretty dismal groundwater basin map, and it was not loved by many staff. And so we worked with our GIS staff this year to create a new map that shows our various groundwater basins in the city. And so you can see here the hashed yellow and red lines represent the different groundwater basins, where the blue line represents the city boundaries, and the red line represents our Foothill groundwater basin. So I just wanted to share with you that we have a new resource available to us to depict the city's groundwater basins, and this will be included in our enhanced urban water management plan. Next slide, please. Desalination is another important resource within the city's water supply portfolio. It's a critical part of our water supply, and it's played an extremely important role in drought recovery as we've been coming out of the last drought. And now as we're looking at potentially going into drought conditions in the future, it's allowing us to store more water in Lake Cachuma as we produce desalinated water and use it, which helps us with preparation for any future droughts. Next slide, please. And finally, recycled water is another important supply that we have available to us. The recycled water plant has been operating and meeting customer demands. I anticipate that we'll have probably fairly high demands on that system this summer if we do have the higher temperatures that are being predicted. And fortunately, the plant is ready to go to meet those needs. Recycled water plays a really important role because it allows us to offset what would be potable water used for irrigation with recycled water instead. And as part of the enhanced urban water management plan, we'll be kicking off an updated market assessment and cost benefit analysis, looking at opportunities to connect potentially new customers to the recycled water system this fall. So we'll be coming back with that to you later in the year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll take a look at our water supply strategy. We can move on to the next slide. And this is really where we put those demand slides that we looked at previously, and then our water supply slide together, and we look at the big picture. And so this is another graph that we've been sharing with Water Commission for several years now. You can see that it has data back to 2012 and then projects out to 2023, so future conditions. The tops of the individual bars within the bar chart represent demand for any given year, and then the different colors within the bars represent the different supplies we use to meet that demand. And so we have actual numbers through 2020, and then we're projecting out to 2023 to see that we have enough supplies to meet demand in the future. And when we look at this analysis, we always assume worst case scenario. So basically, we assume that we have dry years like we have had this winter, and that those dry years continue 3 years into the future. And so the story that's told here is in 2012, we had quite a bit of storage in Cachuma, and we were relying primarily on Cachuma and Gibraltar water to meet city needs. And then as we went further into the drought, you can see that we reduced our demand with great help from our customers, and our supply sources changed. We started relying more on State Water Project water and groundwater. And then in 2017, it's a small little bar there, but then more in 2018, desal came online to help us meet our needs. And then moving forward, currently, we have so much water stored in Lake Cachuma that we project that we'll be using primarily Cachuma water and desalination to meet needs out into the future, with potentially a little bit of inflow from Mission Tunnel as well. And so the big picture story here is that we have plenty of water to meet needs, even in dry conditions, out to the future. And that's really a result of prudent planning and our diverse water supply portfolio. Next slide, please. And this is really just a summary of the graph that we were looking at just now. Again, due to prudent planning and water supply management, we don't anticipate any water shortages through water year 2023. We can continue to rest our groundwater basins and let them recover. And that's really because we have so much water, over 24,000 acre feet, stored in Lake Cachuma. It will take several years for our groundwater basins to continue to recover. We're keeping an eye on that water debt that we need to pay back. And kind of the big picture story here is that our community has continued to embrace water conservation as a way of life, and that's really helped us manage our water resources into the future. Questions?
Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation, by the way. Thank you. It's always good to get updated like this. My question has to do with storing water in Cachuma. It kind of bleeds over into the next item that we're going to be talking about, but this is a good case example. And again, sorry for the kind of base question. Are there any rules or regulations in place today about how much water we can store, and basically how much that somehow gets then allocated to other uses and or drought and or evaporation or whatever? You know, what are the rules on how much we can really put in there?
Great question, Commissioner Davis, and this is something that's always on the forefront of our minds as the water supply planners. We actually met just yesterday with the other Cachuma member units to discuss issues related to this. I'll try to give a brief answer. It might be a good topic to come back with in more detail in the future, but our water supply contract for Lake Cachuma currently allows for carryover water. And so what happens is that in the summer, so soon in July, the member units are going to submit a request for our allocation on Lake Cachuma. And the language in the contract is kind of loose, and basically our full allocation, which is 25,417 acre feet. That's not just for the city, that's for all the member units combined. then the Bureau is supposed to provide a full allocation. Again, that language is loose, and typically, if the water's there, they provide it. But the Bureau has raised some concerning questions within the last year on feeling uncomfortable with how much carryover water some agencies, specifically the city, have stored in Lake Kachuma. And so they're talking about, in future iterations of the water supply contract, potentially putting limitations on that. So our current contract has no limitations, but that is something that we're alerted to, and we're gearing up to negotiate with the Bureau in the next round of negotiations, which should happen soon.
Okay. I also remember a graph that we've had at other updates in the past that showed the Kachuma water and how it is allocated like that. And that's very informative for people like me to see exactly how the allocations versus the unallocated versus the required water, et cetera, et cetera. So sometime in the future, I'd like to see kind of that updated slide also. Thank you for the answer.
No problem. And that's actually a really great note. So that graph that you're talking about is one that's produced by the county, and it portrays the data in one way. COME, the operator of Lake Kachuma, is updating a storage model for Kachuma, and they're producing their own graphs, and the member units really like how that's looking. So we're refining it now, and maybe as we have a more public draft version of the graph that they're developing that does show all the different types of water stored in Lake Kachuma, we could definitely bring that forward and share it with you.
Commissioner Young?
Thank you. Great report, very informative. Could you go backwards? There's a slide where you have a bullet point addressing the injection of treated wastewater into the ground. I
Yeah,
just
that's
have
the
some
groundwater
questions.
slide.
Right,
There it is.
right, the ASR. So where are we in that process? I remember some discussion about the Regional Water Board being concerned about taking treated wastewater and injecting it into the groundwater basin and it degrading, so to speak, you know, the
Excellent.
quality
Thank you
of
for
the
appearing,
groundwater.
Ms. Taylor.
Thank you.
I'm going to let Ms. Taylor take this question because she's been working directly on that
Yeah,
project.
Chair Keller and Commissioner Young, we are in process working with the State Water Resources Control Board on that. We just had a meeting within the last 2 or 3 weeks. There were certain concerns because there's a couple sites, cleanup sites currently underway, and the concern was that any work that we were doing would not disrupt the plumes from these contaminated sites. And the good news is, and it was an excellent meeting that the State Water Resources Control Board staff put together, because they had all the stakeholders involved. They had members from each of the who are working on the contaminated sites, as well as the city staff and our consultant as well. And it turns out that these contaminated plumes, that the groundwater basin itself has a upper level and a lower level, and the contamination that they're working on is in the upper level, and where we would be injecting is in the lower level. So once we've gotten through that hurdle, right now we've been moving forward in a plan, but that is definitely headed in the right direction. So I consider that meeting was a big victory for the groundwater basin, because it looks like we are definitely going to be able to inject into the basin. Thank you.
Okay, and so what's the time frame for this? Like, what's the next step? Does the city have to do something, or are we waiting for the state board?
Well, I believe the ball is in our court, and since we had that meeting, now our consultant has to put forward a monitoring plan for the state's Water Resources Control Board staff to approve. And so we are moving forward. As for actual timelines, I would say, we will be doing it later, maybe the end of summer, early fall. I'm hoping to be, we'll have more information on that we can report back.
And was the Office of Drinking Water involved in that meeting?
No, the state
Is well, they are now under the umbrella of the State Water Resources Control Board. They've moved over to come under
Correct.
that umbrella. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious whether they were involved in the meeting, because they're the ones that would raise the public health concern with respect to this.
Well, the staff on the meeting were staff from the State Water Resources Control Board, staff from the city, our consultants, and there were 3 different contamination sites. One was a gas station and 2 were dry cleaners. And those are who were on the meeting. And we were able to, again, to determine that there was an upper and a lower basin to that actual basin but there was nobody on from the drinking water section.
And then how much water would we anticipate we could inject into the ground and then be able to recover?
I don't have that information right now, but I would love to come back with this topic once we start, we're more in process on that. I think that'd be an
Yes.
excellent topic for to come back.
Yeah,
in
thank
the
you.
fall.
I think it's a really interesting topic. I'm very interested in the topic as well. I think it's better if we put it into a presentation for a future
Yeah.
meeting, so we understand it better, understand what's going on, and all these really important questions can be addressed, and we get all that. But thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for asking the question. It's an
Thank you.
excellent topic.
That would be great, Chair Keller. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Commissioner Cooney?
Actually, I had a similar question to Commissioner Young, and so that was addressed, and I appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Councilmember Sneddon? Okay, her screen says, there you go.
Oh, can you see? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
So I just want to point out here a few things. They aren't questions, but comments. Is that all right, Chair Keller?
Sure, of course, yes.
Thank you. So I love the new groundwater basin map. I think it's I've used that one in teaching too, and so this new one is very very nice. Appreciate that one. And when we're talking about the groundwater injection, I'm glad we'll have a presentation on that, a more full presentation. I can hear Edo McGowan's voice in my head coming to public comment and talking about the issues with groundwater injection. So it would be good for the public to understand that everything's being considered and what's being considered. And I just want to say, whenever we have this presentation and you make it so clear about how diversified our water portfolio is and how complicated with the exchanges, and that some of those exchanges are paper exchanges and some you referenced an engineer exchange, and there's so much going on with all of these interactions. And then you mentioning that it's cheaper to buy it in the wet year versus in the dry year, and I'm just so grateful for your work. But then also I was just thinking about that we have this whole water commission that also is sort of checking everything and representing constituents and people and ratepayers. And then on top of that, this enhanced urban water management plan that reached out to the whole community. And I'm just, to see it all come together in this way with your planning, and we're right where we predicted. And even though we hear things in the news about, it's drought and emergency, and it's really gratifying to every time you give this presentation to see how things play out. And I just wanted to say thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Young, you have another question?
I do, Chair Keller. Thank you. And if it's not the appropriate time to ask it, let me know. We can handle it later. We're currently now in a stage 1 drought condition, right? And when do we then reevaluate? Yeah, stage 1. When do we reevaluate that?
That's a good
what
question,
time?
Commissioner Young. Typically, the 2 times that we consider changing that declaration, I would say sort of outside of a drought emergency, would be now at the end of the rainy season. And then we also kind of look at it at the beginning of each water year. And when I update these water supply outlook projections, we've maintained status quo thus far because our groundwater basins are still pretty depleted from the last drought. And so that's been the reasoning that we've stayed in that stage 1 water shortage condition. And I think now with the dry conditions that we're seeing across the state, even though the city's supplies are really in good shape, it's prudent to stay in that stage 1 water shortage condition just to keep everybody's attention on our water supplies moving into dry weather. And also because our groundwater basins still need some time to recover. That's been the thinking thus far.
And, you know, I appreciate that. And my thought would be, maybe we should move into stage 2.
Yes.
Yeah, simply because with everything I'm reading, which is a lot of material, we could be heading into a mega drought. You know, our groundwater basins, as you say, are not at capacity. Our state water supplies, if we were to forecast out, I would think those are going to be precarious. And so, you know, I see we're fine until the end of 2023. It still makes me somewhat nervous to think that. And I'm just wondering whether stage 2 might be more appropriate. And I also say that because, you know, the people that I know that ask me questions, because they know I'm a water commissioner, say, why are we still allowing people to water lawns and to do things that seem to be kind of counterproductive and possibly wasteful with water? And so I hear that from people. So I'm just curious, you know, when that discussion is going to happen. And
I
it
think
sounds
that's
like maybe it's not until the beginning of the next water year. It would be what, July 1?
Yeah, so staff's recommendation at this point would be to wait and see what happens with the next rainy season, actually. And the reason for that is, you know, drought declarations are declared at the local level based on local conditions. And so that's what's maybe a potential challenge for us right now at the city is statewide. The water supply condition across the state is fairly poor because we had such a dry season, but because of the city's planning, our water supplies are quite secure right now. And you'll see actually in my next presentation, and I hope this will help, we're going to talk about our new water shortage contingency plan, which defines the different stages 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then also we're going to talk about a 5-year drought outlook, which is a new requirement for urban water management plans. And I'll just give you another spoiler. The 5-year drought outlook for the city is also very good. So even looking 5 years out with very poor precipitation, if we are going into a next drought, the city is in good shape to meet demands. And so I think at this point, where we can really use help as staff as our messaging, you know, sort of not discrediting what's happening at the state level, because that's very real, but also reassuring the public that because of prudent planning, both from staff and Water Commission and our decision makers, the city is actually in quite a good position right now with its water supplies.
I would add that in that messaging,
Thank
we
you.
have to, you know, remind the public that it's also because of their conservation efforts that has
Absolutely.
helped much. And you mentioned it, and we have to remind them that it's thanks to them and then all the planning that has been done that we've been able to do what we're doing. What would change if we declared, you know, stage 2 versus a stage 1? And what's the implications? Why would we do that?
There's additional actions that the council could include in a stage 2 drought declaration. So, you know, potentially regulations on how water is used within the city. You know, we could have time of day watering restrictions. We could have restrictions on what's watered and when. And so we'd be sending messages on how people use their water to really try to drive down demand. But I think currently our demand is actually sitting right where we want it to be. So I'm personally a little leery of hammering that message on our customers right now when they're kind of just coming out of the fatigue of responding to the last drought. And it would be, I think, a good idea to let them use water as they are, which is still very conservative. It's still 24% less than 2013. And then if we are heading into another prolonged drought, we'll be able to ask them to step up and help us reduce demands as things get more dire.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ms. Corey. Commissioner Davis, did you have a question, or if not, we're going to go to public comment?
It really wasn't a question. I was just going to ask whether because this was just an update, whether we'd want to put this on an agenda next month or in July, and come back and discuss it in more detail.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Thank you.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Yes, so I think we have some public comment.
Chair Keller, I'm not seeing any hand raised. Members of the public, if you'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature and we can unmute you for that. There were 2 questions
Okay,
posed. Would you like me to read those?
yes, please.
So, Ms. Corey, these 2 questions relate to Mission Tunnel inflows. One of them is, can you just elaborate more on the inflow from Mission Tunnel? And the second, what is the flow contributed by groundwater in the unlined portion of the tunnel? Is this impacting lower groundwater levels? How does it interact with the groundwater levels?
I can go ahead and take a stab at that. I know that we have some interest in the community about this issue, so it might be something that we have to defer to later on. But on average, infiltration into Mission Tunnel supplies about 1,200 acre feet per year of water supply to the city. That can definitely vary depending on precipitation and how much moisture is in the soil that's infiltrating down into the tunnel. In terms of infiltration through the tunnel, whether or not it's lined, I'm not the best person to answer that. Our engineering team manages Mission Tunnel, but my understanding is that Mission Tunnel isn't lined. It's an earthen tunnel. I don't know, Mr. Ward, if you have additional information to add to that answer.
No, I think you answered the question really well. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Ms. Corey. So let's move on to the next topic, which is the discussion on the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. Please go ahead.
All right, and surprise, it's me again. So again, my name is Dakota Corey, and I'm the water supply analyst for the city. And I'm now going to provide an update on our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. Those of you that stick with Water Commission know that this has been a long-term ongoing project for the city. We've been working on it for almost a year and a half now. And we're kind of at the final stages of this project, which has been really gratifying and exciting to work on. And so in this presentation, I'm just going to show you where we're at in terms of preparing our final Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. So next slide, please. Outline of my presentation. First, we'll look a little bit about where we've been in terms of preparing the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. So it'll be a brief project summary. Then I'm going to go over Urban Water Management Plan requirements. So the Urban Water Management Plan is a specific plan that the city is required to prepare every 5 years. And there's very specific requirements for that plan. And so we'll go over that, and then we'll talk about how our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan both meets those requirements. So we'll talk about the key elements and findings, and then goes beyond that. We'll also describe our 2021 water shortage contingency plan, which came up in my last presentation about drought stages and actions that we can take when we're in a drought. We'll also talk a little bit about Delta reliance reporting, which is a new requirement for urban water management plans. And finally, I'll go over the project schedule and next steps as we wrap up this important project. Next slide, please. So where we've been. You'll recall that the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan has had a couple names. We branded it for the public as Water Vision Santa Barbara. And that was a really appropriate name because the goal of this project was to develop an equitable, resilient, environmentally friendly, and cost-effective plan that sets the vision for the city's water supply and management for the next 30 years. So this is a long-range plan looking 30 years out. Next slide, please. And the preparation of this plan has been largely stakeholder driven. This has been a really important feature of this planning process. We created a stakeholder group that had 20 active members. They participated in 5 different workshops and actually 2 optional workshops on top of that. And from those stakeholders, which represented a diverse variety of our water users within the city, we really got an understanding of our community's values around water supply and water supply planning for the future. We also included the general public in this process. We had Water Vision Month in October 2020, which really brought the public to the table to learn about our water planning and to contribute to this process. We continue to outreach and educate on this process, and currently a public draft of the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan is available on the project website, which I have a link to there. It's santabarbaraca.gov/watervision. And then moving forward, we're going to have a public hearing on the draft plan next Tuesday at Council, which is May 25th, 2021. Next slide, please. And again, I'm just kind of summarizing where we've been. So one outcome that's come out of this process thus far is Council adopted some specific policy recommendations on how we want to manage our water supplies moving forward. And so we had a discussion on these policies at Water Commission in January, and then on February 9th, Council adopted these policies. And as a reminder, the first policy that was adopted is that we're going to implement the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan recommended actions for our existing water supplies. And so there's specific recommendations for each of our individual water supplies that I described in my last presentation that will help us better utilize and optimize them moving forward, and we'll be working to implement those. The second policy that was adopted was to execute the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan Adaptive Implementation Plan. And so this is really a recognition that water management in Southern California and in Santa Barbara specifically is super dynamic. There's new regulations, there's different weather patterns, there's all kinds of things that are coming at us at a regular basis that change the like the playing field that we're operating in within our water supplies. And so we need to be able to be nimble and responsive. And so we've developed an adaptive implementation plan that allows us to make decisions for our water supplies moving forward and respond to whatever changes might come our way. And the third policy that was adopted by Council was to continue ocean desalination as part of Santa Barbara's water supply portfolio to support drought preparedness, response, and recovery. And this was really demonstrated as a value in my last presentation, which shows that when we utilize desalination as a fairly consistent contributor in our water supply portfolio, it allows us to store carry over water in Lake Cachuma, which then leaves us in a good position to respond to drought conditions as they appear. Next slide, please. This slide just outlines the 5 major steps in the preparation of our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. We've seen this slide before, and if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you see the orange "We Are Here" arrow, and that arrow has moved quite a bit over the last several months as we've been working on this process. So we're finally in step 5, which is document the plan. And this is really where the ends of this project kind of get wrapped up. And so we've done in steps 2 through 4, we did a lot of very detailed analytical work, both on our current water supply portfolio and future water supply options. We used a highly technical process to evaluate our water supplies that looked at many different factors, including environmental, financial, and social. And from there, we developed our plan moving forward, including that adaptive implementation plan. And so here in step 5, this is really where we package it all together. And again, because we are submitting this as an urban water management plan to the California Department of Water Resources, we're packaging it in a way that will meet all of the requirements for those plans. And I'm going to explain that further as we move forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about urban water management plans. As I mentioned earlier, it is a state mandated plan that needs to be submitted to the California Department of Water Resources every 5 years. And there's specific analyses that are required to be within those plans. And so, one thing that we must provide are water supply and demand projections with a 20-year planning horizon. Because our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan is enhanced, or bigger than a typical urban water management plan. We actually went out 30 years in this planning process. We also need to report on our water conservation targets. There was a Senate bill, SB X7-7, that required water agencies to reduce their water use by 20% by 2020. And so now that we're preparing our 2020 urban water management plan, we're going to report on how we did in comparison to those targets. And the good news is that we far exceeded them. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also are going to be looking at our water supply in both normal and drought conditions, similar to what we talked about in the water supply update, but there's really specific requirements for urban water management plans that I'll explain in a little while. This plan also includes a 5-year drought risk assessment, which is a new requirement. And finally, the water shortage contingency plan, which outlines our different drought stages and the actions we can take to reduce demand if we have a water supply shortage. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to remind everybody here that the basis of all of the information that's reported in our urban water management plan or our enhanced urban water management plan is the supply planning process that we've undertaken for the last year. And in previous presentations to Water Commission and Council, that technical memorandum that summarized all that work was called the Future Portfolio Analysis. As we were writing the urban water management plan, we recognized that that name didn't really make sense in the context of a larger planning process and an urban water management plan. So we've renamed that appendices. It's now the 2021 long-term water supply plan. So in the past, the city had had 2 separate documents. They'd had a long-term water supply plan and urban water management plan. And we've melded them together now. So we have an enhanced urban water management plan. And the basis of the planning and the outcomes in that urban water management plan are this appendices that outlines all the analytical work we did. I hope that that makes sense. It is a little bit confusing, but I'm happy to answer questions if anybody's confused. Next slide, please. So let's dig into what's in our enhanced urban water management plan. What did we find? Regarding water supply and demand projections, you'll recall from previous presentations that we developed new demand projections for the city with the help of Matos Water Management, who was working on our water conservation strategic plan for the city. We updated population and commercial growth rates with the help of our community development department. And I'm going to go into that in more detail in the next slide. But prior to that, I also wanted to say that we also included current and future water conservation. So we know that the city will continue to support conservation as a way of life and have an active conservation program, which will reduce demand. So we need to consider that when we're projecting demand into the future. And that includes both active conservation and passive conservation. So active conservation are the programs that the city implements to help our customers reduce demand. Passive conservation comes from things like the plumbing code, which are implemented and result in reduced demand because of more efficient fixtures and better building practices, et cetera. A final note here that our baseline demand projection also included an assumption that coming out of this last drought, we wouldn't rebound fully to pre-drought demands, but maybe we would hit 90% of those pre-drought demands. And we recognize that that rebound is going to take some time. So that wouldn't happen until 2027. And that's an assumption that we had some questions about, so we tested it. I'm going to go into that in the next slide. Let's just go to the next slide. So this digs a little bit deeper into the population information that was included in our demand projections. The source of our population data was the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments Regional Growth Forecast 2050. Which was released in January 2019. Again, this was provided by our Community Development Department, which is in charge of our general plan and all of the future planning that happens for the city on a big picture scale. So this is really a collaborative process where we make sure that any planning we're doing at the water level is tied into the big picture planning for the city. We also included population for Mission Canyon, which is outside of city limits, but is served city water. And so the source of that data was the Mission Canyon Community Plan Final EIR, which was released in April 2014. And a reminder here in terms of population, for Santa Barbara. Within our service area, the city is largely built out. There's not a lot of vacant land where there could be large new developments. And the type of development that we're seeing is really redevelopment and infill. So what that looks like is a lot of multifamily housing, which is typically very water efficient. There's not a lot of landscape associated with it, and it has the newest and latest, most efficient fixtures. And so the development we're seeing really isn't contributing large amounts of new water demand. Another note that's interesting about Santa Barbara is we're a community that has a large tourism draw. And so we have a lot of visitors that come into our city and use our water resources. And we're also a city that has lots of commuters that come in for work each day. And when we're looking at population, we don't include those people. And so when you're making comparisons of demand versus population, the population as we define it is the population that lives within our service area. But what we know is that there's actually all these other people that are also using our water resources. And I'll explain that further in another slide on why that's important. Finally, at the bottom of this slide, you'll just see a summary of our population projections out to 2050, both within the city and Mission Canyon and the total. Next slide, please. So as we developed our demand, we recognized that demand projections are not a strong science, although we were very scientific about how we developed them. There's a lot of assumptions that are built into them. We don't know exactly how much our population is going to grow. We don't know how our economy is going to perform and how that's going to drive our commercial water demand. And so we wanted to ask some questions and develop what we called a demand envelope, which is kind of a range of possible demand outcomes. And so you'll see in this graph, we have historical demand, which is the dotted line. We have the old demand projection from the 2011 long-term water supply plan, which is the gray line. And then the envelope is that shaded blue area you see on the right-hand side of the slide. And so our baseline demand projection is the black line. And you see demand increasing sharply, both with the drought rebound and the addition of water supplied to Montecito Water District, and then leveling off. But then we were asking questions around, well, what if population grows more than we think? Or what if the economy doesn't perform as well as we think? And what will that do to affect demand? And that's where we came up with this red upper bound of our potential demands and the green lower bound of our potential demands. And the upper bound is a combination of higher than projected population and also high economic growth. And the lower bound represents a lower drought rebound. So maybe coming out of the last drought, our demands only rebound to 80% instead of 90. And if you combine that with lower economic growth, you get the low bound demand projections. And what this really does is it allows staff to track where we're at in terms of demand, because as we're looking at that adaptive implementation plan, that's going to be one of the driving factors about when it's time to make new decisions around our water supplies. So I think that summarizes our demands. A question, Commissioner Davis?
Yes, just remind me, if you could, the Montecito agreement amount to kind of like, so I could visually think about where that goes into. It's 1,000 plus something.
It's 1,014. It's 1,430 acre feet per year.
1,400. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And Councilmember Sneddon?
Thank you, Ms. Corey. So this demand envelope is really interesting. And I think I just have some questions. You said the upper bound demand projection. So that's with good economic growth or high economic growth and high population growth.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I've seen this before in this way. I think we've always sort of talked about, as you said in the last slide, that because of modernization in plumbing codes and the type of infill that we would have, that it doesn't actually create a higher demand. So I'm just pausing here for a second to make sure I understand. So the historical demand, I mean, this would take us higher than any historical demand, the red line on the envelope.
Yeah, so demand planning assumes that the city is going to continue to build out according to the general plan. And so with that new population growth, we're going to see associated water use. And then again, we also had the increase related to Montecito Water District. And so when we're looking out 30 years, even with the effects of water conservation, because those are included within this envelope, we are seeing a moderate increase in demand. But if you look at the green line, the lower bound, that actually tracks more closely with that old demand that we see declining from the long-term water supply plan. And that's why we wanted to create this envelope, because we recognize we could fall anywhere within there, depending on a number of different factors.
It's really valuable. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
If I could, just on that question, the way I asked that question was, if you look at the difference between the green and the gray line, that's the population growth, and then the gray line to the black line really is Montecito by and large. So the question Councilmember Snedden had, it's easy to see essentially the green line relationship and then the bump of the 1,400 acre feet that takes us up to the black line. So it's a good graph.
Commissioner Cooney?
This might be in the weeds and I apologize. Feel free to tell me, you can tell me more later, but what goes into the projections, the modeling around tourism? Like just as, and like, is there any kind of incentive for, is it hotels or restaurants or whatever that go into it? And is there incentive for them to, I don't even know how to put that, have more, water, wise fixtures, or encourage their guests to not use as much water. I mean, that seems like a pretty complicated, not that everything else is really simple, but that seems like a really complicated thing to model. And I was just sort of wondering what, like a little bit about what goes into that.
Yeah, so it is definitely complicated. We have what we call an end use model that was produced by Meadows Water Management. And so end use meaning that we look at the fixture level, where is the water coming out of the faucet? And then that works backwards towards how many hotels are there and how many rooms do they have? And so where you would see the effect of tourism on these demands is in the commercial factors. All of our customers, are classified as residential or commercial. And so we have growth rates associated with those commercial factors that play into this demand projection. And then in terms of conservation requirements, we have a very cooperative hotel and restaurant industry in Santa Barbara. And we do have active programs for those specific businesses where the city provides support, but most of them actually already do it on their own. So we have things like tents that people, that go in the rooms that say, you don't need to wash my sheets every day. And we also have programs to help them install efficient fixtures if needed. When we were in the heart of the drought, we did a lot of messaging with our hotels and restaurants about, serving water only on request, and they were super cooperative. So the driving factor in these projections is it would be in the commercial growth rate. And in terms of that industry and helping us with our overall water conservation in the city, they're quite helpful, and we have direct communication with them.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I've seen those obviously, in hotels in the water, and I just never had a picture of if it actually worked or not. So it's great to hear that does make a difference.
Great. All right, I think we can probably move on to the next slide. So this is another important aspect of the urban water management plans that I mentioned earlier, and that's our water use targets and water conservation. So the Water Conservation Act of 2009, often referred to as SBX 7-7, required every water agency in the state to reduce their water use by 20% by 2020. And here we are in 2021, and so it's time to report on how we did. And so you can see that our 2020 target water use was 117 GPCD, which stands for gallons per capita per day. So water use per person per day. And in 2020, our GPCD water use was only 92. So not only did we meet our target, we far exceeded it. And there was definitely some help with the drought there in reducing demands. But again, this is just so indicative of how our community in Santa Barbara really embraces conservation as a way of life and values our water resources. You can see that clearly in our tracking of our water use with gallons per capita per day. And this again is where that tourism and commuter piece comes in, because when you're looking at gallons per capita per day, you're looking at overall water use divided by population. But because our population doesn't get to include those tourists or those commuters, it's not a good metric to compare water agency to water agency. So say our neighbors in Goleta maybe don't have as many commuters or tourists. I don't know that that's a fact, but just as an example, they may have lower GPCD numbers because that denominator again is population, and they don't have sort of this hidden population of tourism and commuters. So the only reason that I really bring it up is just to know, one, that like we absolutely exceeded our goal and we did fantastic. And it's usually not a good idea to compare GPCD values from agency to agency because every agency is different. Next slide, please. Okay, water supply during normal and drought conditions. This has really been the heart of urban water management plans since I worked on them for the last several years. And what we do is a supply and demand assessment based on the 2021 long-term water supply plan. So all of that planning that we've done leading up to this enhanced urban water management plan. In terms of the data that went into this analysis, we used historical hydrology on the Santa Ynez River from 1942 to 2019. And then from there, we have to define a normal year, a single dry year, and a multi-dry year. And this is really urban water management plan lingo that comes out of the California Water Code. It's very specific on how we have to define it. And so looking at that historical record of 1942 to 2019, for a normal year, we just define that as the average of that entire hydrological record. The single dry year was the driest year on the Santa Ynez River, which was 2016. And then multi-dry year refers to 5 consecutive dry years. And our 5 driest consecutive years were 2012 to 2016. So as we went through this analysis, those are the years that we applied to define each of those conditions. Next slide, please. Results of that assessment show what we've seen with our larger enhanced urban water management plan analysis. In normal years, the city has sufficient supplies available, and we have typically excess supplies that we can store for future dry years. So again, that's our carryover water in Cachuma. That's letting our groundwater basins rest when we don't need them during dry years so that we can call upon them during dry years. In a single dry year, again, because we have such a diverse water supply portfolio, we don't usually run into problems at all with supply and demand in the city if we just see one dry year. Again, we can easily meet those needs with carryover water stored in Cachuma, groundwater, and our various water supplies. As we know, again, from the work that we've been doing on the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan, it's really multiple dry years or consecutive extended drought where we start to see supply shortages at the city. And so in the multiple dry year analysis as defined in the Urban Water Management Plan, what the results show is that in year 5 of 5 dry years, we would see a water supply shortage of 20%, meaning that's when we would want to ask our customers to reduce demand through different water supply actions by 20% so that we can make sure that we met that demand. And we know that that's very possible. In the last drought, our customers reduced up to 40%. And in the last drought, we saw extraordinary conservation, or this extra conservation in response to water shortage required in year 3 of the drought. And so this new study showing that we probably wouldn't see that shortage until year 5, again, really plays on the fact that we've developed desalination and we're managing our supply as well. And so with all those, the water stored and carryover, we do well 5 years out. And there's another way to look at this in here just a minute. Next slide, please. So this is that 5-year drought risk assessment. I brought this up in my water supply update presentation. This is a new requirement for urban water management plans. And the question that it asks us to answer is, if we're going right into a drought now, what does our water supply situation look for the next 5 years based on current supplies. And there's a lot going on in this graph, so let me just help you orient a little bit. You'll see about 1/3 of the way up on the graph, there's a solid black line that represents our projected demand from 2021 through 2025. Then each of the bars on the chart represent available supplies, and the different colors represent where that supply is coming from. And so you can see the dashed black line at the top of the chart shows total supplies available in each of those given years. And so what this graph is showing us overall is that even if we are looking at 5 dry years starting right now, we have adequate supplies to meet our needs. We actually have more supplies than our demands. And so what does that look like in terms of how we would meet those needs? Let's look at the colors of the bars below the black demand line. So you would see in 2021, we've used water from Gibraltar, desalination, and some of our water from Lake Cachuma allocation. Moving into the next dry year, we would rely more heavily on our Cachuma allocation and still rely on desalination. Again, also recycled water is always a baseline supply in these situations because that's a drought-proof supply. And then you see from 2023 out to 2025, really where the majority of our water supply starts to come from is that Cachuma carryover water. So water that we've had stored in Lake Cachuma that we can now call upon as supplies start to diminish. And so again, this just really shows that even if we're going into 5 years of drought conditions, we have adequate supplies to meet our demands moving forward. Question, Commissioner Young?
Thank you. I'm just confused as to why you're showing groundwater being available if we're trying to rest the groundwater basin right now.
So we still have groundwater in storage that if, our situation water supply wise got really bad or dire, we could call upon that water and use it. And so that's why it's shown as available supply, but it's not shown as a supply that we'd actually use. So everything below the demand line is what we'd actually use to meet demand. And all the rest of those supplies are supplies we have available to us that we're not tapping into. So it really is kind of showing that we're still resting those groundwater basins. Does that make sense?
Explain that to me. Yeah, I was confused. Thank
Commissioner Davis?
Yes, thank you. On the graph, and again, maybe this is not the place to ask it, or maybe it is. Reading in the report, if Cachuma spills, we quote unquote lose all our carryover. And obviously it's not going to spill because we just had a big drought here, so it looks like this.
Right.
But if it did, that yellow would go away. I'm assuming then the dark blue Cachuma allocation would grow. Gibraltar would grow because it would have filled if Cachuma is spilling. Gibraltar's got water in it. What does our supply look like when we're not carrying such a big, in a spill year? What would our supply look like in terms of the total on the y-axis there?
That's a really good question, and I don't know if I have those numbers right offhand to answer it in terms of a numerical value, but I think you're thinking about it in exactly the right way. If Cachuma spills, it's a really wet year. And so like you said, we have full Gibraltar supplies available to us. Gibraltar can provide like 4,500 acre feet per year when it's full and spilling. We have desalination available to us still, which is 3,125 acre feet per year. Mission tunnel infiltration is another 1,200 acre feet per year. So in terms of meeting demand in a wet year like that, we're in really good shape. And you're right, we would have a full allocation on Cachuma, so that's another 8,000 acre feet, even if our carryover went away. And we would also be seeing increased recharge to our groundwater basins.
Yeah, so I'm up over 16, 17,000. So we're
Yeah.
up there approaching 20. Good, thank you.
Yep, no problem. All right, and if there's no more questions, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so another important element of our enhanced urban water management plan is our water shortage contingency plan. So this is a requirement for urban water management plans. It is going to be a separately adopted document, so it's a standalone document. that allows us to make edits to the water shortage contingency plan on our own without having to update the urban water management plan if we feel that edits are necessary. Overall, it's a detailed plan for how the city intends to respond to foreseeable and unforeseeable water shortages. It includes 4 water shortage stages, which I have a slide on next so we can see that more specifically, and also a menu of shortage response actions that council can choose from to reduce demand as needed. And one thing that I really want to emphasize here is that our experience going through a couple of droughts now, most recently the city experienced the late 80s, early 90s drought, and then our most recent drought that began in 2012, is that each drought situation is unique, and the needs of the community during those droughts are also unique. And it's really valuable for council to have a wide menu or a lot of tools in the toolbox that they can call upon to help the community reduce demand. And so we really tried to develop a large list of possible actions rather than a very surgical and detailed, you do A, B, and C, and that's how you get to a certain point. We want to give council the opportunity to really respond in the way that seems most appropriate to them. So there's a large list that they can choose from. Next slide, let's look at the stages. So this table outlines the stages that are included in the water shortage contingency plan. You can see on the left-hand column the number of the stages. So we have normal supply when there's no supply reduction required, and then stages 1 through 4. Stage 1 is when we need to reduce supplies by 0 to 15%. Stage 2 would be a shortage of 15 to 25%. Stage 3, 25 to 50. And stage 4 is 50% or greater. And really stage 4 is meant to look at sort of those unforeseeable catastrophic events, like say there was a large earthquake and Tecolote tunnel collapsed and we could not bring water down from Lake Kachuma, something like that. So it's that type of emergency. And then you can see on the right-hand side of the table, a more detailed description of each of these stages and kind of what leads us to that need to reduce our supply. Next slide, please. And this is just a very, very brief list of some of the types of response actions that are included in the water shortage contingency plan. Public outreach is huge when we're experiencing water shortages and we need our customers' help to reduce demands. And so we increase the messaging out to the public quite a bit as one of our response options. And it's hard to quantify the savings that we get from that public outreach, but just having the community aware so that they can start to change their behavior is really important. We can increase the amount of water checkups we do. There's a picture here on the slide of a water checkup happening. This is where we go onto customers' property and we go through their water using fixtures, both indoors and outdoors with them, and help them figure out how they can reduce their water use and potentially find leaks. The council would have at its disposal prohibitions against water use. So maybe there's prohibitions on watering your lawn in the middle of the day or the days of the week that you water, things like that. There'd also be water waste regulations that could be enforced. We could have increased rebates for both indoor and outdoor water using fixtures that people could install to reduce their water use. And there's also a long discussion on operational changes that the city can take with its internal departments to reduce the city's water use. And there's some really creative things that we were able to do in the last drought and document that made some significant changes. And so this, again, is just like a taste of the different actions that are included in the water shortage contingency plan that council could potentially call on if we needed to reduce water use to meet demands during a shortage. Next slide, please. So we're transitioning here to another requirement in the Urban Water Management Plan. This came out of the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Reform Act of 2009. And basically the idea here is that any agency that performs an action that is related to the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta needs to show that they're reducing their reliance on that system. And so because the city is a recipient of state water project water flows through the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. And so therefore we need to include this section in our urban water management plan. And so Appendix O of the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan addresses this requirement. And the overall summary of the results is that the city clearly demonstrates reduced reliance on the Delta as a result of its diversifying water supply portfolio. And so for lots of reasons, we know that the reliability on the state water project is decreasing, and the city has been actively working for many years to diversify our portfolio so that we still can benefit from state water project water, which can be extremely valuable to the city at certain times, but also reduce our reliance on that system overall. And so that's demonstrated in Appendix O. Actually, I'm sorry, it's Appendix D of the 2020 Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. And then as a requirement of this legislation, we also have to add Appendix O to our previous 2015 Urban Water Management Plan. So again, sometimes urban water management planning is just responding to a lot of regulation, and this is kind of one of those instances, but the overall story is a good story in that we are really reducing our reliance on the Delta. Next slide. All right, so as I said, this is kind of the final stages of our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. And so I'm just gonna provide a quick overview of where we're headed in terms of kind of wrapping up this project. So on May 3rd, we released the public draft of the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan on the project website. And just a reminder, that's santabarbaraca.gov/watervision. So it's available currently for anyone and everyone to review and submit comments, and can be accessed through that website. Next Tuesday, May 25th, we'll be going to City Council for a public hearing on the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. And then between May 25th and early June, we'll incorporate any comments that we received today at Water Commission, or even in the future from Water Commission, at Council, and from the public into our final version of the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. We'll release that final version on June 4th, again, for the public to review and take a look at. And then it's scheduled for adoption at Council on June 29th, 2021. And we'll be submitting it to the California Department of Water Resources on June 30th, 2021, because it's due July 1st. So with that, it concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Corey. That was a lot of information, but thank you for presenting it very clearly. We've seen this before, but I think this was a very good summary of a lot of things and some different ways of presenting it. Yes, Commissioner Davis.
I have a question, a couple of comments, and a suggested addition. If I could, Mr. Chair, just go through them all.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. On my question, we have this discussion of adaptive implementation throughout the plan, and yet at some points, like on the first page of the executive summary, we call it adaptive management planning, adaptive water resources management strategy. I wonder if you could basically define the difference. I went to Google and tried to figure out the difference. I'll tell you what I found if you want, but I'm curious. Adaptive water resource management is something which is a term of art, which I think we all kind of generally understand, and what we've been doing to a large degree.
Mm-hmm.
Adaptive implementation, at least as I understand the definitions, is a different thing, where you set out rules and you follow those rules over time and whatever. I'm just curious. I'm personally more comfortable with the adaptive resource management as you describe in the summary of the plan on page ES1, rather than adaptive implementation. And I'm sure you've had lots of discussion on that subject. So my question is, what's the difference? Why are we on one versus the other? And convince me somehow that adaptive implementation versus adaptive management is the way to go.
So I'll just be honest here. I don't think that the different words were used in any sort of conscious way in the report. I think that our intention was along the lines of adaptive management in terms of the two definitions that you just shared that you had found. And if there's one that commission prefers, we can absolutely go through the document and change it. As I explained earlier in the presentation, the idea is to be adaptive and nimble and respond to changing conditions as they occur.
Yeah, totally agree with that. That's exactly where I'd like to see the commission come down. Okay, on the second item, you may recall, in the previous reviews, I had at least some base questions. Base questions, not really the right word. Threshold questions of the change in how we use desal versus the old strategy of using surface water first, desal as the backup. And frankly, after all these months, you got me. You have convinced me. All right, I see where you're going with it. And so congratulations, because I was basically a hard rock that was going to be hard to move, but you really did move me. So I get it. However, right? Then when I started looking at the question that the entire plan to a certain degree, our strategy here is built upon if you call the prompts in the long-term water supply plan, right? Storage for Kachuma, storage for state water. Actually, you didn't put in there, but acquisition of supplemental supply. Desal as a base supply is built upon building these other storage capacities and supplies, and desal basically being the base that gives us the ability to build that storage. I like that. That's why I said I get the strategy. It took me a while, but I get the strategy. However, basically then, I think the most important thing I found in the long-term water supply plan, top of page ES 8, in the executive summary of the long-term water supply plan, says in addition, several prompts for significant changes in operating conditions were identified, including right? The implementation plan should be reevaluated and updated in response to such changes. I think that statement is so important because the plan is built upon this construct that if those foundational issues change, right, be it the regulations, be it the storage, being it the ability, like we just saw in the amendment we had up at the county, the ability to purchase and sell and or trade water, if those things change, the whole plan there relative to how we use desal could be there. So my suggestion is that at least in the long-term water supply plan, if not in the overall document, that summary be bolded so you don't lose it, because it's a foundational premise. And as such, then when you go into the 3 policy recommendations at the end there, the implementing actions for existing water, executing the adaptive or management implementation plan, continuing desal, that there be a 4th policy, and that is if, again, taking those things, if those base conditions basically change, we need to come back, reevaluate and update. And policy 4 would be keep your finger on those things, because if they change, we got to talk. So that's the otherwise, it's been an incredible process, and all I can do is congratulate you, the rest of the staff and the consultants in getting us to this point. But those 2 points in terms of adaptive resource management, the foundational elements, and if those foundational elements change, we got to come back and talk. So that's very important to me. In our recommendation up to council, I'd hope the commission would support on those 2 major issues, basically making a strong recommendation. The council take a look at that. So again, thank you for all your good work.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Davis. I think that was quite useful. Just on the quick point on the management versus implementation, I think implementation is part of management. I mean, management is broader. So I think adaptive management would cover everything. Implementation is only a subset because there's also, monitoring and replanning and all sorts of things that go with management. But yeah. Commissioner Young.
Thank you, Chair Keller. Kind of just a general question. Was it helpful for the state to mandate that this be done?
No, that's a really good question.
Because you hear frequently members of the public complain about state mandates. And I'm just wondering, briefly, I don't want to get into a big philosophical discussion, but was it helpful to have the state lay out requirements and guidelines for developing this?
So I'm going to answer that question with 2 different hats. I'm going to answer it with my City of Santa Barbara employee hat, and then I'm going to answer it as my water resources planning professional hat. So first, from the perspective of the City of Santa Barbara, I've worked for the city now for over 6 years, and my experience is that it's a very proactive group of staff and decision makers, and that this type of detailed planning is something that the city had been doing and would continue to do regardless of whether or not there was a state mandate. So from that perspective, I don't know for the City of Santa Barbara specifically if it is particularly helpful, but then wearing my other hat as just a water resources planning professional, and I have worked previously as both a consultant and for another water agency, I would say that those mandates were really important. That wasn't necessarily something that rose to the top of the to-do list for various water agencies, and so having that mandate did make the agencies sit down and take a good look at their water supplies and their planning into the future. I think where it gets really tricky with state mandates is water agencies across California are all so unique, and a one-size-fits-all approach is really, really hard to develop. And I appreciate that the state regulators do make it a public process and get the water agencies involved as they're developing regulations, because it can be that regulations are developed that can be really onerous or difficult for a water agency to comply with just because of their unique characteristics.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that answer.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments? Yes, Councilmember Sutton.
Thank you, Chair Keller. Ms. Corey, I'm always amazed. It seems like you don't breathe the whole time you give this presentation. It's so amazing. And I mean that as a compliment. It's just the wealth of information and then how it dovetails with the presentation. I do have a question. I want to go back to the slide about the drought risk assessment, the one that you said has a lot going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Go back
And
to that.
Yeah,
Crap.
I can't read what number it is. It's maybe, I don't know, 12 or something.
Malcolm will get us there, I'm sure. Oh, too far. Keep going. It's the graph with like 5 bars that there it is right there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not even sure how to frame this question exactly, but this figure, which by the way, I also like how you've adjusted over time, taking away the white bar at the top, like we used to have, and that's, you know, the new normal, that we just don't even have that bar anymore is I think
Right.
really great choice. So in this one, you have the supplies available and the demand, and then you have in slides later, which you don't need to go to, but that how drought levels are defined are based on state water allocations. So I just want help with the connection between, I mean, it almost seems like it doesn't matter to us if we're in a drought or not. I mean, given the way this looks and that it depends on the state water allocation. And I don't know exactly the question, but if you could clarify that, like, so why would we care if we were in a drought? Or if the governor or the state was in severe drought for prolonged or a mega drought? And I'm sure it does matter. It doesn't connect for me these two graphs where the drought is declared by sort of external factors that we're not that reliant on. If we look at this chart, if you could just, I don't know, speak to that a little. And I'm not sure I'm even articulating the question well, but something about
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Let me give it a stab. I want to make sure that I'm understanding your question correctly.
If I may just
Oh, yeah.
try to clarify it a little bit. If we went ahead with 2 more years here of drought, and therefore the supplies available would go down to where it's dipping below our demand, that's where things would get really complicated, right? And so
Yes.
the question is how, but why, I agree with Councilmember Sneddon that why does it depend on the state water project? It could depend on whether, we have no water available from Kachuma. And so it could be a local situation that also gets us to calling it a stage 3 or 4 or 5, yeah?
Yeah, and so that actually is the point that I wanted to clarify, because it's not dependent on the state water project. And I'm thinking that's coming from that table that showed the shortages, where you were reading that. So if we can skip ahead to that table, please, that has the 4 different drought shortages. And I just want to, maybe we need to edit that link. Is this one here? And so I'm thinking you're looking at these descriptions under water supply condition. And it talks about being linked to Kachuma entitlement. And that there's no other shortages, but I'm not thinking here that it's linked to the state water project. It is more specific to local conditions.
Okay, yeah, there you are.
Thank you for that clarification, because we went through this slide and I somehow thought it was linked to our allocation from state water. And then you said how we're lessening our dependence on state water, diversifying the portfolio. So I wasn't making the connection. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And I just, for comments, I agree with Commissioner Davis and about emphasizing that 4th recommendation. It is, I don't think, really well understood by our ratepayers, and I don't think it's well understood by our county representatives, how reliant we are, how all those moving pieces come together. And if you just pull one thread, the base of all of that is out of balance. And I think this presentation, you describe it so well. And part of that too, and I said before with the enhanced urban water management plan, the process that you went through, which I always, at council, I always say that's the process to use. What you all did for this enhanced urban water management plan with the brown bag lunches and the meeting with and all the different stakeholders, and with really a focus on equity. And I can't emphasize enough how much I applaud that. It's not just the people who come and have the sort of time in their day to come and make a lot of comments. You really went out into the community and drew that input in, and that the stakeholders, I really like to emphasize that. I mean, you had so many different groups who aren't usually at the table for this type of discussion. And I just can't say enough how much of a model it is for what we should be doing for public outreach, and emphasizing that on that 4th recommendation from Commissioner Davis, that this really is the will of the ratepayers and the people and the community with equity in mind. And that is, I think, to be underscored, that is, that's who we're responsible to, and that's what this document does. And it's such an excellent document and process, and just congratulations. This is the end of a long process, and I'm looking forward to hearing it at council and supporting you there as well. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I do also want to emphasize that I think I support very strongly what Commissioner Davis said in terms of that 4th recommendation. I think the whole commission would think so. So yes, but we should probably hear from Councilmember Young and Councilmember Cooney. Well, so do we have any public comment at this point? Yes, Commissioner Young.
Was there a question posed to me, Chair?
Yeah, well, the point was, Councilmember Davis made a very important point, and I think that recommendation is really important. So I just, I strongly recommend that we adopt that recommendation, and I think that's as important. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Okay, Councilmember Cooney.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's
Okay,
great.
thank you very much, Jeff. I think that's very important for the 4 of us to, state that very clearly.
Great.
Commissioner Davis.
Yes, thank you. I did leave out one thing, and it mainly because I lost this battle in our last discussion. This is on the long-term water supply plan, page ES3, and we're talking about the suggested water reserve thresholds regarding converting desal to standby. And as you go, I had a pretty good discussion with staff and the consultants last time about the 180,000 acre feet, which is the third bullet there. and I thought we had a lot of discussion as to splitting the difference between the 120 and the 180 and going to some 140 or something that essentially was not at the top, but more in the middle, if you will, before we would get to droughts. So again, I personally basically felt that the 180, and these are suggestions. And so my real comment why I don't think this is the other 2 points I think I feel very strongly on. This is a suggestion. And as our 2011 long-term water supply plan, by 2015, that was out the door because we were dealing with reality and adaptive management. We had to make changes. And so under real conditions, I think the water supply manager is going to make the right calls in that regards. But, right, to nudge them, I'd still like to see that be the mid-range at the 140 rather than the 180. So other than that, I'd be willing to make a motion when we're ready to go.
Okay. Do we have any other questions or comments? No. Do we have will we have a motion at this point, or will we?
If we had no public comment, I will go to a motion.
Okay, so let me ask for public comment first, sorry. Do we have any public comment?
Chair Keller, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time. There were 2 more questions submitted. Would you like me to prompt
Yes,
staff with those?
Yes, please.
So Ms. Corey, this is another question regarding Mission Tunnel. How critical is the Mission Tunnel infiltration as a source of supply during drought conditions? So when there's a drought, how critical is Mission Tunnel intrusion as a supply?
Okay, that's another good question. When we're in a real drought situation, I'd say all of our supplies that we have available to us are important and critical. The Mission Tunnel supply is reduced during drought conditions because the soil is drier and we're not seeing as much infiltration. In terms of the last drought, I would say that supply provided, trying to do some math in my head here, less than 10% of our total demand. And the rest of that demand was met by our other supplies. So that might put it in some numerical context. But I mean, when we're in a drought, every supply we have available to us is important and critical.
10% or less than 10% is 1 month or 2 months worth of water. So that's still quite significant. Yes.
And there's one more question. Was there a part of the enhanced urban water management plan that looked at increasing water flows to the creeks for wildlife and also for fire protection?
There is not a section in the enhanced urban water management plan that looks at those 2 issues specifically.
There's no other hands raised for public comment, Chair Keller.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So yes, Commissioner Davis, you want to make a motion?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd make a motion to recommend council the approval as recommended of the enhanced urban water master plan with 2 items. One, changing the adaptive implementations discussion to adaptive management plan. And 2, a new long-term water supply plan policy 4, that if the prompts as identified are changed, there would be a need to reevaluate and update the plan at that point.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second it. I'll second it.
Thank you. Okay, so if we want to have a roll call, please.
Yes. Commissioner Cooney,
Yes, agree.
Commissioner Young,
Yes.
Vice Chair Davis,
Yes.
and Chair Keller.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. So now we have Mr. Maldonado giving us the information on the contract for the design of the Cater finished water reservoir. And Mr. Maldonado, you're a little bit under pressure. We do have some time constraints, but we don't want to rush too much. So, please be as brief, but complete. Thank you.
Absolutely. Chair Keller, Commission members, Council Member Sneddon, good morning. I will be as adaptable as I can be and move through this presentation. I am a supervising engineer with the city and manager for this project. I am here to present on the Cater Finished Water Reservoir Resiliency Project. Next slide, please. Why are we presenting today? Staff is recommending authorization of a contract for design for this project. We're asking for Water Commission support of this action prior to taking this recommendation to council. We will provide background for the project along with an overview of the current status, description, timeline, budget, and the intended goals of this work. Now, in the broadest terms, the goal of this project is to increase the overall resiliency of the city's water treatment system. This will be achieved by adding a new chlorine contact time reservoir to the treatment process. The photo you see here is an aerial view of our Cater water treatment plant. In the center is a green field. This field covers the roof of our existing clear well, where the required chlorine contact time for disinfection is currently achieved as part of the treatment process before water is distributed to the city along with our regional partners, Montecito and Carpinteria. This presentation will review how resiliency will be increased for both treatment and storage, the background of this facility and why this work is needed, the project's current status, and provide a description of the work that is being recommended. The project is necessary for the long-term sustainability of this facility and the broader regional distribution system, and staff recommends continuing this project forward. Next slide, please. For the design phase to move forward, staff recommends awarding a contract for design to Carollo Engineers in support of this project. Carollo was selected through a competitive request for proposals process. They were designated as the most qualified to deliver the project's design from a total of 3 firms who submitted proposals. As described in their proposal, Carollo has completed over 65 projects throughout Santa Barbara County, including multiple projects for the city of Santa Barbara. Through their work, Carollo has developed extensive knowledge of our city. Specific to this site, they designed the advanced treatment project at Cater and have recently completed 3 of the 4 evaluations used to support this project scope. Next slide, please. As initially mentioned, the primary goal of this work is increased resiliency. But how is resiliency defined for this project? Resiliency will be achieved in multiple ways. First is by increasing the amount of water storage available at the treatment plant. This additional storage will allow for greater operational flexibility by allowing the existing clear well to be bypassed for extended periods of time. The design scope includes the addition of an approximate 2.5 million gallon reservoir. Second is by extending the time available for chlorine contact to occur in the treated water. The normal operating state of the new reservoir will be to provide the needed chlorine contact time required for disinfection compliance. This will leave the full capacity of the existing clear well as a treatment buffer if there is ever a need. Finally, piping modifications will allow blending additional city supply sources like desalinated water conveyed through the distribution system. Combining these sources at Cater expands the reach of these additional sources throughout the city and the region, maintaining the treatment plant as the distribution hub for the city and our regional partners. Next slide, please. In the next few slides, we will review the project background. This will include the existing clear well and how it functions in the system. Please note, the image on this slide depicts the existing clear well and the basic elements of its configuration. We will also review the assessments that have been conducted, the needs these assessments were developed to address, and the recommendations provided, an expanded description of the benefits that will be realized by adding storage capacity, and how the proposed design will be centered on maintaining regulatory compliance. Next slide, please. Constructed in 1962, the existing clear well has an operating storage volume of approximately 5 million gallons. The existing clear well sufficiently achieves all regulatory measures required of the treatment process. With that said, there are operational limitations that impact the long-term viability of this facility if not addressed. First, with only one reservoir, there are limited operational scenarios that allow for the needed periodic cleaning and inspection of the reservoir. This constraint also greatly limits the ability to replace or repair equipment internal to the reservoir. As this reservoir ages, the need for increased maintenance becomes greater. Second, increasing regulatory requirements is an emerging concern for the city. Staff have been working closely with state regulators to use modern tools to assess the full treatment effectiveness of the existing clear well. The image that you see here on this slide is from a hydraulic model of the existing clear well. It indicates the possibility of water short-circuiting across the clear well at extreme operational conditions. This design will ensure complete treatment for all flow conditions through the new reservoir. The design will also include an in-depth seismic and structural assessment of the existing clear well that will inform staff on any current deficiencies that may impact the long-term needs of the facility. The results of this structural assessment may result in an expanded design and construction effort. Staff have anticipated this possibility and have budgeted accordingly for this second phase of the design and construction if needed. Next slide, please. The city conducted 4 separate assessments in order to develop this scope of work. First, the Cater Yard Piping Modifications Technical Memorandum was completed in October 2018. This technical memo analyzed piping modifications and routing options to blend additional city water supply sources conveyed to Cater. These modifications will improve overall supply resiliency by expanding the reach of these additional sources throughout the city and the region. Second, the Cater Clearwell Structural Analysis Technical Memo was completed in January 2019. This memo assessed the structural capacity of the existing clear well to accept modifications to the interior that would benefit the treatment process. Third, the Cater Clearwell Chlorine Contact Time Evaluation Technical Memo, completed in February 2019. This memo evaluated the requirements of the existing clear well to achieve disinfection permit compliance. And finally, the Cater Chlorine Contact Basin Feasibility Study Technical Memo, completed in June 2020. This memo analyzed the feasibility of 4 possible locations for a new reservoir at the Cater Water Treatment Plant. Completing these assessments enabled city staff to develop the recommended scope of work for this project. Next slide, please. The photo on this slide is from the interior of the existing clear well during periodic maintenance. During this maintenance, the reservoir is operated at 1/4 its volume on only one side of the reservoir, so a continuous supply of treated water is provided to the city. There are very limited times during the year that this mode of operation can be achieved while maintaining the required disinfection contact time. Additionally, the risk of operating at this diminished capacity limits how long access to one side of the reservoir is available. For the majority of the year, the entire reservoir must remain in service, and this limited access represents a significant liability if a situation emerged that required immediate response. The new reservoir will allow for bypassing the existing clear well for the full range of flows through Cater. This will allow for complete access to the existing clear well for an extended period of time if needed, both for periodic maintenance or more extensive repairs as they are identified. The new reservoir will be designed to achieve the required chlorine contact time for the full range of flows. It should be noted that a properly designed reservoir can accomplish this in approximately half the volume of the existing clear well. The ability to bypass and maintain complete treatment through the new reservoir will expand the range of operating conditions available to staff. This expanded operational capability greatly increases the long-term resiliency of the existing clear well, as well as the overall distribution system for the city and our regional partners. Next slide, please. This slide shows another view from the interior of the existing clear well. As shown in this photo, the size of the interior equipment requires additional time to both maintain and replace as needed. The proper functioning of this equipment is key to the treatment that this facility provides for regulatory compliance, as well as the ability to store and move water where it is needed throughout the city and into the South Coast conduit for our regional partners. The proposed new reservoir is intended to fully address all regulatory compliance needs of the treatment process. These include operational flexibility that will allow both reservoirs to be maintained independently, supporting the system resiliency for the life of both assets, The new reservoir will include elements that will that allow it to treat the water for regulatory disinfection compliance using half the volume of the existing reservoir. The improved hydraulics of the new reservoir will optimize the treatment of water to ensure required chlorine contact time is achieved. With the proposed new reservoir in place, the existing clear well can be assessed in greater detail and more extensive maintenance can be performed in the future. Next slide, please. As mentioned previously, the scope of work was developed using multiple assessments and drawing from the operational knowledge and experience of current staff. The primary scope objective is to construct a new reservoir adjacent to the existing Cater clear well. This will allow the existing clear well to be used for storage and supply balancing. Adding this new piece of infrastructure will require connective piping and modifications to the inlet and outlet structures of the existing clear well. Carollo's proposal included an effective design approach centered around the use of industry-leading tools for modeling and analysis. Combined with an extended history of implementing similar projects, Carollo stood out as the best firm for implementing this work. Staff are ready to proceed and with the design effort, which builds upon the preliminary work that has been completed. Next slide, please. So what is included in this design? In its simplest form, it truly is the design of an optimized chlorine contact reservoir. This reservoir will meet full disinfection compliance at half the volume of the existing clear well. The proposed new reservoir will be designed to bypass the existing clear well when needed. Additionally, the design will include the operational ability to bypass the new reservoir using the existing clear well as needed for future maintenance. The normal operation of the new reservoir will be to provide the needed chlorine contact time for the process. This will leave the full volume of the existing clear well for receiving conveyed supplies from the distribution system and storing additional volume when needed, all while continuing to function as the distribution hub for much of the South Coast. To receive these conveyed supplies, the inlet and outlet structures of the existing clear well will be modified. There will also be connective piping that will allow for these different modes of operation. The image on this slide is a three-dimensional rendering of the proposed new reservoir along with the connective piping. As you can see, there is some initial investigation that will be required to ensure the physical structures and associated piping will fit into the existing site. Along with this site investigation, the existing clear well structure will be evaluated using finite elemental analysis to provide a thorough evaluation of its current condition. Next slide, please. This slide provides a general overview of the planned schedule for this project. A key component that I would like to highlight is for the coordinated funding. For this project, staff will be applying for a drinking water state revolving fund loan. The commission may have recently heard discussions for the use of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Through our ongoing coordination with the state, we were made aware of the different protocols associated with implementing the drinking water SRF. For drinking water, the state prefers coordinating with the municipality as early in the design process as possible. As the schedule shows, we will begin our funding application at the concept level of the design. The anticipated benefit of this coordinated effort will be a shorter time frame between the award of the loan and the implementation of the funding agreement that allows for the beginning of construction. Alternatively, for the clean water loans, the agreement coordination does not begin until after the loan is awarded, which can add up to a full year before construction is allowed to start. Next slide, please. For this project, staff have estimated a total cost of $10.6 million. The entirety of these costs are anticipated to be covered by the drinking water SRF loan. The interest rates for these loans are extremely low. Additionally, the state has more funding available for drinking water SRF projects, making the process a bit less competitive. There is a one-year application process, but as stated earlier, this process will begin early in the design development. Taking advantage of these loans for projects like this helps reduce the rate burden and allows staff to match timing of cost with the realized benefits. Next slide, please. This slide provides a general breakdown of the total project cost. I would like to note the cost was developed as part of the broader water system planning efforts. These planning efforts have not only helped organize this work, but have supported planning for rates and future budgeted capital work. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, the design effort will include an in-depth seismic and structural assessment of the existing clear well. During the design, staff will review the results of the assessment to determine needs that can be addressed with the current design effort. This assessment will provide staff with recommended strategies to mitigate structural weaknesses that may be identified. Staff have anticipated the possibility of needed work developing from these strategies and have budgeted accordingly for the second phase of both design and construction. The budgetary estimate for this work is $7.7 million. If needed, the full project cost could increase to as much as $18.3 million. This second phase of work would be added to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund loan. As a final note, I should be clear, the majority of this work, other than the connective piping at the site, will be cost shared with our regional partners by the terms of our joint powers agreement. Our partners are aware of and supportive of this work and the lead role the city is taking. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to close as I began. Staff is requesting that Water Commission support the authorization of this contract and allow staff to continue this contract for design with Carollo Engineers to City Council for final authorization. As we have discussed, this project is necessary for the long-term sustainability and resiliency of this facility and the broader distribution system. Thank you very much for your time, and I would like to address any questions you may have, as I know I did move through that fairly quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Maldonado. Thank you for moving it through it fairly quickly, but it's a clear presentation. Quick question, what's the minimum contact time that they're aiming for?
Oh, actually, I do not know off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah, it's buried in there, and as I am not a water operator and in charge of operating the facility, I could get that number to you, but I don't have it with me.
Okay, thank you very much. Water Commissioner, Commissioner Cooney.
This might be another, you're going to get the answer to us, but I actually had another question or similar questions about the chlorine contact time, and I'm sorry. But just, I was a little bit curious about, you said that it was going to be increased from the previous storage facility, and I was just sort of wondering, at some point, like what the benefit versus the cost of the increased chlorine contact time for, like, how do you choose the chlorine contact time that you're really, like aiming for there? Like, how do you choose that versus, like at what point, obviously there's a minimum, and then I'm sure at some point it continues to get better. Is there a point where it's like diminishing returns and you're paying more for not as much benefit, and just sort of like, how is that, how do we look at that? But again, feel free to get back to me later. Sorry about that.
Commissioner Cooney, I will take a short stab at it.
Great.
And it might actually address a bit of what Chair Keller was asking earlier as well. Of course, there's 3-log removal is what it's called, which is 99.99% removal of bacteria or any virus removal. And it's a combination of the shape of the facility and what is called a baffling factor. As far as how the water moves through that structure and at what pace it moves through, and whether that there's enough time and energy to allow the disinfectant to move throughout the entire water column and stay in contact for an extended period of time. And so that in general is what kind of goes into it. We don't have necessarily a cost benefit on what size of facility is best. As you know, most of our facilities are site constrained, and we will be trying to fit this in as best we can. Mr. Ward, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to, so the state has given us a pretty generous baffling factor. The existing reservoir is basically a box with some columns in it with an influent and effluent side on either ends of the reservoir, and they've identified that we needed to study this and we need to address any short circuiting that may occur. So that's where part of this project was developed. But as Mr. Maldonado pointed out, a lot of this project has to do with the fact that we know we're going to need to do significant work in the existing clear well, which is going to require at least temporary storage, but on an ongoing basis for resiliency and maintaining treatment for not just the city, but also our JPA members that we need to be prepared. So that was a big focus of this project when it came to design.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, do we have any public comment at this point? Commissioner Davis, sorry.
It's a comment, not a question. I love good presentations. I found this to be an excellent, informative presentation. So I just wanted to give the comment. Good job, Mr. Maldonado. I really did that. And I love the photos. It reminded me of my tours of the cisterns of Istanbul. And so tongue in cheek, when are we going to charge for public tours? So I will be supporting a recommendation to move it on to council. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I'll leave those tours to Mr. Ward.
Okay. Any other questions or comments at this point? Do we have any public comment?
Chair Keller, I'm seeing no raised hands for public comment and no additional questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have the recommendation. Do I have a motion?
Moved. I'll move the recommendation.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, so if we can have the roll call, please.
Commissioner Cooney,
Agreed.
Commissioner Young,
Yes.
Vice Chair Davis,
Yes.
and Chair Keller.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Maldonado. Thank you for your presentation and getting us here almost on time. So we have the Water Resources Management Report. Maybe we can do something brief to go through that and just the highlights, Mr. Ward.
Yeah, I'll keep it really brief because we are short on time, and we actually touched on quite a bit of that information with the reports that Ms. Corey was given, and she did so well on. So one update or just reminder really is that we will be, City Council will be doing interviews for advisory boards and commissions beginning next week on the 25th and continuing till June 15th. So that will be good to help make the commission whole. Other than that, I'll just open up for any questions regarding the Water Resources Manager's report and that report that you received. And if there's no questions, then we can wrap up.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner Young, do you have a question?
I do. Quick question. We had a public question about the Mission Tunnel supply, and it made me think about asking this question. Historically, have we ever run out of Mission Tunnel water?
Not to my knowledge, no. It's been fairly continuous, but I think we're gonna, Ms. Corey, do you have something to add?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, it's the way we calculate Mission Tunnel infiltration is we measure how much water we send through Mission Tunnel from Gibraltar, and we measure what comes out of the tunnel at the end at the penstock meter. And so the difference between the volume of water that's coming out at the end of the tunnel and what went in is Mission Tunnel infiltration. Or if we're not diverting water from Gibraltar, any water that's coming out at the end of Mission Tunnel is infiltration. And so that water always exists. It does vary in volume depending on the hydrological conditions and weather, but other than that, it's always there.
So what does this mean that we have 44 acre feet planned through the end of the year? Does that mean that we can have that source of water through the summer? Well, obviously, we're not going to be drawing any out of Gibraltar because it's dry.
Yeah,
So
we see
is there a
infiltration into the
residual
tunnel.
still?
We see infiltration into the tunnel year round.
Oh, okay. All right. I didn't know that. Thank you.
And I'll add that there is a little bit of planned use for some of the remaining supply that's in Gibraltar to perform maintenance on the hydroelectric plant. That tunnel intrusion water does contribute a significant amount of water to Laurel Reservoir and allows us to operate that plant with sometimes a minimal draw on Gibraltar. So it does allow us to maximize the use of the hydro plant. And with that, I'll
Okay.
just say, is there any other questions?
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Ward, and thank you, Ms. Corey, for your presentations. And I think this will conclude today's Water Commission meeting, and the next meeting will be on June 17th, 2021. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.